Hey, my name is Onwuemene, and I am a hematologist. I specialize in bleeding and clotting disorders or in disordered hemostasis and thrombosis. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the things that I love, love, love to talk about, and that's the coagulation cascade. And, I think the coagulation cascade is best seen pictorially. It's hard to talk about the coagulation cascade. That's why I'm going to keep it pretty high level today. I'm not going to talk about the nuances of factor 5 activates factor 10, none of that. I really just want to talk about thinking about the coagulation cascade in terms of kind of like the big picture. Okay. So I think the most important thing to note about the coagulation cascade and why it's important to us is because it does help us understand hemostasis and thrombosis as well. And the most important part of the coagulation cascade is the formation of fibrin, right? Is the laying down of a fibrin clot. So why does the coagulation cascade happen anyway? The coagulation cascade happens because there's been a break in the vasculature. So there's been endothelial or vascular injury. And the body, first of all, activates primary hemostatic mechanisms, and that's platelets coming together to form a platelet plug. But the platelets coming together to form a platelet plug is kind of like a temporizing strategy. What you really want is for a fibrin clot to be laid on top of the platelet plug, and you want the fibrin clot to be super strong. So it gets cross-linked. Okay. That's the goal. The goal of the coagulation cascade is to form a very strong fibrin clot. And this fibrin clot is laid on top of the platelet surface in platelets that have come to the point of injury, forming a platelet plug. All right. That's really the most important thing. Now, one of the things that's important is that in order to form fibrin, you've got to convert fibrinogen to fibrin. All right. If a person is otherwise normal and healthy, they have enough fibrinogen on board. But fibrinogen doesn't get converted to fibrin unless thrombin activates that reaction, right? So thrombin is factor 2A, activated thrombin catalyzes the reaction of fibrinogen going to fibrin. Now, there's a lot of fibrinogen around. So the limiting reaction in the coagulation cascade is not fibrinogen conversion to fibrin, because fibrinogen is mostly around. It's really the generation of thrombin, so active factor 2. So the generation of thrombin is really the goal of the coagulation cascade. For that reason, we have three major components of the coagulation cascade. The first part is initiation, clot initiation. The second is propagation, clot propagation. And the third is termination, clot termination. Now, initiation is where we're going to produce just enough thrombin, because our goal is thrombin generation. Because if we can generate thrombin, then we can catalyze the reaction that goes from fibrinogen to fibrin. So we want to generate thrombin. And so generation of thrombin is the goal, because thrombin has many things that it does in a feed forward loop to propagate coagulation. Okay. That's why you want to start, first of all, with a little bit of thrombin, okay? And so you start the coagulation cascade. Typically, we tend to think about it as starting through the extrinsic pathway. In our bodies, it's dynamic. It's not starting from a specific point. It could start from the intrinsic pathway. It could start from the extrinsic pathway. But we tend to think about it as starting from the extrinsic pathway when tissue factor is exposed in injury, and that allows factor 7 and tissue factor to come together to form the tissue factor factor 7A complex. Tissue factor factor 7A complex can come together to activate 10 to 10A, and then 10A is important in working together with its cofactor, factor 5A, to activate prothrombin to thrombin. All right, so that's the place that you start initiation. You're making a little bit of thrombin in this pathway. It's not very much thrombin, but it's enough to get the process going, because as soon as you can generate a little bit of thrombin, thrombin acts in a feed forward loop. It goes forward and it activates the intrinsic pathway. It activates factor 8. It activates factor 9. It activates factor 11. It activates factor 13. And it also activates factor 5. So thrombin is very good at propagating itself. Now, the key for the second part of the pathway thrombin generation or the propagation path phase is to generate a whole lot more thrombin. You're going to get a lot more thrombin from the intrinsic pathway, so factor 8, factor 9, that pathway, rather than from the extrinsic pathway. And so the whole point of the clot initiation phase is just to get enough thrombin to really get the process going, and then you really generate a ton of thrombin through the feed-forward action of thrombin and really the intrinsic pathway. It is for this reason that hemophilia A and B tend to be pretty severe bleeding disorders, where factor 7 deficiency is not as much of a bleeding disorder, because the clot propagation pathway is really, really important to getting a lot of thrombin, Okay, so you start the clot propagation usually through the extrinsic pathway and the action of tissue factor and 7 to activate 10 in the common pathway to get thrombin generated. And then thrombin feeds forward to propagate coagulation by activating the intrinsic pathway and continuing to propagate itself. But what thrombin does when it activates the feed-forward loop is it also activates the processes that result in clot termination. And that's really important because that brings coagulation to a close. And then after that, we think about fibrinolysis. So what I didn't talk about was that factor 13, which is activated to factor 13A by thrombin, is also important for cross-linking the fibrin clot and making the fibrin clot as strong as possible. But then termination ensues after clot propagation. You terminate the cascade, and then you break down the clot. And that's fibrinolysis. Okay, that has been a very, 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 very broad overview of the coagulation cascade. And I didn't necessarily want to go into this factor activates that factor. I think it's important to just think about it in the big picture. You initiate a little bit of thrombin generation, and then you initiate a lot of thrombin generation for clot propagation. And then you turn around and you terminate that coagulation cascade, and you allow fibrinolysis to run its course. So that's a short summary of the coagulation cascade. I hope to talk to you again next time. Take care.